All
My
right.
pleasure to be here.
I'll just jump in. All right.
Okay.
Alex Trembath, welcome to the Energy Thinks podcast. I'm so glad to have you join me.
It's my pleasure to be here, Tisha.
So you've spent more than a decade with the Breakthrough Institute, and you've recently stepped into the executive director role. Congrats.
Thank you.
Some of our listeners may not be familiar with the Breakthrough Institute, even though I reference your work often. But how would you describe for them the Breakthrough point of view on energy and climate?
So the Breakthrough Institute was founded a little under 20 years ago to modernize environmental politics for the technological adventure of the 21st century. We were kind of those of us who were at the Breakthrough Institute came up as environmentalists. We were concerned about climate change. We were fans of low carbon energy technology, and we were sort of charting the sort of ongoing process of economic growth and modernization and these new technologies. And we kind of identified that the traditional kind of environmentalist approach to dealing with pollution and dealing with land use change was not going to help us solve climate change, or it was certainly not going to get us all the way to a solution to climate change and to global biodiversity loss and deforestation caused by agriculture. We just needed a much more sort of technologically focused and technologically ambitious way to deal with these emergent sort of 21st century global environmental problems that required a whole new posture to technology and growth. Really a completely different approach than the very tech and growth skeptical approach that had become the norm in the massive and institutionalized environmental movement by the dawn of the 21st century. And so we set about to create a new environmental politics for the 21st century. We later called that politics eco-modernism, which puts sort of modernization and technology at the center of our framework, as opposed to just the environment. We started out with a vision to make clean energy cheap as the sort of central focus of dealing with the problem of climate change. And I think it's fair to say that making clean energy cheap has become conventional wisdom since Breakthrough was founded. And I think that's both due to the success of the Breakthrough Institute and our the sort of efficacy and persuasiveness of our research and our analysis and our sort of policy advocacy. And it's also just due to the positive proof points that we have in technological innovation since Breakthrough was even founded. Since 2008 or so, we have seen massive cost declines, obviously in renewable energy technologies like solar and wind, and even more recently lithium-ion batteries. But we've also seen, sort of radical technological improvements in oil and gas production and the shale fracking revolution. Natural gas in the U.S. is still the main driver of emissions reductions in the United States over the last 20 years. Solar and wind are catching up, but natural gas replacing coal is still the main driver of decarbonization. We're now looking at similar revolutions in next generation nuclear technologies, in enhanced deep earth geothermal drilling, in carbon capture technologies. And that's due to just the sort of extent to which making clean energy technologies cheap as the sort of core focus of an environmental and climate agenda has become the sort of modus operandi, has become the conventional wisdom since Breakthrough was founded.
So I love the tour you gave us, and I'll just give two personal reflections on it. One is that when I found the Breakthrough Institute 15 years ago, it was becoming sort of a de facto orphanage for people who were environmentally minded and climate-centric minded, but not satisfied with the environmental status quo. And we were all sort of coming together to go, there has to be a better way. There has to be something better than just opposing everything that sort of like old school conservation mindset. And so there was this real community that built around eco-modernism, which is really interesting, but it was like it was kind of fringe and geeky, and we love to talk amongst ourselves. But to your point, in the last year, it feels like the world came to the Breakthrough Institute, not Breakthrough Institute came to the world. So either your influence is just off the charts, or you were right all along. Either way, it's pretty cool that a lot of more mainstream environmental and climate minded people are saying things that Breakthrough Institute has been saying for a really long time. So I want to kind of build on that idea, because that's really why I wanted to talk to you. Like where are we going to go now? What's going to happen now? All of us who are thoughtful and care about both energy abundance, technological advancement, just general human prosperity and flourishing, like all those things. You've said, and the Breakthrough Institute has said more broadly, that we sort of passed peak climate. And I was really feeling that today as I was listening to all the politics of the midterms, and we're barely even talking about policy at all. There's just so much about personality, right? Like the personalities of the candidates, the personalities of the parties. So we're barely even talking about policy. Never mind climate's like somewhere, I don't know where, over to the side. But I'm curious. Do you think if we're past peak climate, is there an energy transition? What is the energy transition? How do you square that circle? Because I know that you and all of the people associated with the Breakthrough Institute are keenly interested in addressing carbon emissions and climate. So how do you think about those things?
It's a great way to frame the question, Tisha. And to be clear, when I say, or when we say that we have passed peak climate, what we don't mean is that climate change is not a problem anymore, or that we've passed peak emissions, which is empirically not the case. What I mean when I say we've passed peak climate, or that the era of the climate hawk has ended, which is how I put it, is that, for most of the time that the Breakthrough Institute has existed, for really all of my career, certainly through the 2010s, and at least a decent ways into the Biden administration, climate change was the sort of central intellectual organizing force for, like rich world progressives, for the Democratic Party in the United States, and for just elites and intellectuals generally, going through philanthropy, through sort of big corporates, having a kind of climate vision, having an agenda for your state or your company or your party or your government reaching net zero emissions by the middle of the century was non-negotiable. And everything was kind of framed around how do these things that I'm doing contribute to the climate agenda, and that meant a number of things, but that really was the kind of central organizing intellectual and sort of policy and political framework for elites in the wealthy world, really after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the so-called end of history, where you had, it wasn't the only thing people cared about. There was international terrorism, there were financial crises, there was a pandemic that you may have heard about, but the kind of through line of a bunch of all of that was, we've got these other crises that we're dealing with, but what we have to get back to is solving climate change so that we can have a livable future. And that was very powerful. And it led to, again, the net zero ambitions of not just governments, but really most of the big sort of Fortune 500 companies. And it led to just a kind of monoculture in how cultural elites talked about sustainability and climate change. And it led to a kind of monoculture in how people thought about personal sustainability and about their sort of lifestyle choices. And I think all of that is over, frankly. I think that with the re-election of Donald Trump, it's clear that a kind of conservative populism in the rich world is not just this aberration that happened because Hillary Clinton lost by a few tens of thousand votes in 2016, but that there's a much bigger cultural and political counterweight to sort of elite progressive climate hawkery. I think that the sort of geopolitical and military conflicts that have intensified over the last few years have kind of pushed both political, but also the security concerns related to climate change to the back burner, not away, but to the back burner. You have sort of increasing saber rattling from Gaza or from China. You have the war in Gaza. Tisha, you and I were recording this 2 days after Ayatollah Khomeini was killed in a sort of massive bombing raid conducted by Israel and the United States. You have concerns about Taiwan. You have concerns about Latin America. You have a sort of increased global concerns about immigration and migration. And to talk about the thing that I think is most salient to this conversation, you have the dawn of artificial intelligence, which I think we're just beginning to understand. There's no going back from the age of AI. Just in the last few weeks, the capabilities of these chatbots, just for a researcher and a public intellectual like myself, is just an explosion in what I can do and what my team of analysts can do. And that's to say nothing of what much better resourced sort of institutions with access to the frontier model capabilities can do, for better or for worse. And so that's what I mean when I say we're past peak climate. That climate change was, if not everyone's main priority, then sort of society's main priority for much of the last generation. And even if sort of climate focused Democrat, for instance, succeeds Donald Trump in a few years, I just do not think we're going back to that world. We have a completely different set of technological, social, geopolitical circumstances that our sort of governing elites and our cultural elites are going to be navigating in the coming years and decades. And I think we got to get really clear about that as folks who care about energy, climate, and the environment. To your specific last question, we can talk sort of more, we can dig into this. But I don't think that means that sort of decarbonization is over. I don't think that means the energy transition is hitting a dead end. In fact, I think that the potentially gargantuan energy demand of AI data centers can be, for instance, a huge source of demand pull for next generation nuclear and fusion and geothermal, and can be a real sort of kick in the pants to our policymakers to actually modernize and reform the nation's permitting and infrastructure policies, so that we can actually build stuff in America again, stuff including transmission and solar and batteries and things like that. So I think it's a potentially huge opportunity actually for sort of climate, like erstwhile climate hawks and for clean energy advocates. But it is not without complication. Right now we're seeing massive new demand for natural gas turbines as well as for solar panels and batteries. So in a way that no one predicted, even a year or two, certainly 5 or 10 years ago. So I think that it doesn't mean, that this new kind of era does not mean the end of climate action, the end of clean energy investment, the end of the energy transition. What it does mean is an entire new set of sort of cultural politics that frames all that, and that everyone really needs to understand that, because I don't think that's sunk in everywhere yet.
So interestingly, I 100% agree with you, and my heart and my brain want to just go down this road of having the conversation with you about the potential for using data center power demand pull to create the next generation energy system. That's where I want to go. But we're not going to do that. We're going to take a U-turn and go back and talk about what you called the climate agenda. I call it the climate orthodoxy. When I wrote my recent book, The Myth and the Moment, I thought what you just described, this world where the policy and politics have moved beyond climate in a way that climate has to be one of many factors in decarbonization strategies. I thought that was going to be so obvious as to be undeniable. What I am surprised as we sit here in 2026 preparing, like the primaries are happening for the midterms, I am surprised at the power of the climate agenda, the climate orthodoxy. I am surprised how dominant it remains in reporting, like climate desks, in democratic policies and politics. And in places like my home state of Colorado, to some degree still in California, there's still a battle waging for the Democratic Party, like maintaining this climate agenda, I think. And I'm surprised, but I think we avoid it at our peril, because in the absence of us really understanding and like figuring out how to help that group of well-meaning maybe people pursue a more pragmatic agenda, I think they may, when the political pendulum swings back, I think they may have an outsized amount of power if the center left doesn't, or the pragmatic climate left doesn't sort of take hold. So let me just first ask you, is there anything else that like describes the climate orthodoxy from your perspective? Like you mentioned, net zero is dominant. Basically, energy policy is climate policy. I would add to that, like, leave it in the ground. Anything else you think before I like ask you a few more follow-up questions about the climate orthodoxy? Anything else you think describes that, as you say, the climate agenda?
The big thing is what Al Gore said 20 years ago this year in An Inconvenient Truth, which was really the big cultural asteroid that put climate change on the sort of mass public's attention. He said that we have all the technologies that we need in 2006 to solve the climate crisis within 10 years. It's now been 20 years. Emissions globally are up like 30% since Al Gore said those words. And by we have all the technologies we need, Al Gore meant that with solar and wind and batteries and electric vehicles, we can fully replace the fossil fuel infrastructure powering the world today, which wasn't true. To be clear, that was not true at the time. We've learned that, we can get a long way with intermittent renewables, but we certainly can't decarbonize entire power grids with them. We've learned that electric vehicles are an important technology, but that batteries are probably at least not going to run our cars and ships and planes and things like that. We've learned that we need carbon removal technologies. We've learned that there's a huge role for nuclear and geothermal and clean firm and a bunch of these technologies that we still don't really have access to. And so that's sort of one side of this. But the bigger reason that I use that sort of quote as an example is because I think it reflects a posture towards society, towards technology, towards innovation that is totally wrong and is totally incompatible with thinking about the future. But, Al Gore says we have all the technologies we need to decarbonize the society we have today. The society we have today is not a static thing. The society that we have today is changing, and now, again, with electrification and with new manufacturing, but especially with AI, it's changing on a week-to-week basis. So the idea that we can look at our technological frontier and our technological future and say, oh, we kind of know what it takes to like decarbonize America's industrial economy and to decarbonize America's homes and cities. It might take 10 years, it might take 25 years, but we would kind of know what goes into it. That is just totally illiterate technologically and economically. It always was, but it's even more so now that the technological and economic and industrial frontier are changing so exponentially and so rapidly and in such a kind of difficult to chart way. And I just don't think that the sort of Democratic Party, that sort of progressive philanthropy, including sort of climate philanthropy, has really reckoned with that yet, has really reckoned with the extent to which their mindset, might have worked for passing energy and climate policies over the last 20 years, where you did have, pretty sort of stagnant U.S. sort of economy and, sort of technological landscape, to the extent that the U.S. economy was changing a lot over the last 20 years since climate change has been on everyone's minds. It was changing on our computers. It wasn't really changing as much in our landscapes and in terms of like atoms and wires and roads and things. The exception is really the oil and gas industry, right? The oil and gas industry is the one big kind of like real capital molecules and atoms intensive industry for which there has been massive growth in the United States over the last 20 years. And so it's not just like plans for net zero, and it's not just sort of keep it in the ground protest politics. that have expired their useful lifespan. It's a whole way of thinking about the future of sort of technological society, and a sort of like nimbleness that is needed in thinking about the future. Because I totally agree that the sort of climate movement, certainly sort of environmental philanthropy, and a bunch of folks in the Democratic Party are out of either kind of ideological dogmatism or just kind of laziness, planning on running the same playbook again next time they win the White House, next time they win Congress, whatever. I think you're right. They might try to do that, but it's not going to work. It's not going to work for their policy ends. And I don't think it's going to work for their political ends. And so that's what I urge everyone, including, the sort of pragmatic wing of the climate movement that has always been pro-nuclear and pro-permitting reform. I think a bunch of the folks who we know still haven't fully reckoned with the extent to which the world has changed and changes on a daily basis now, and to the extent to which that requires a whole new mindset, not just a politics, not just a policy agenda, but a whole new mindset about the future.
That's such a great take, actually. It's such a great take, because I was thinking about things like that the idea that we have all the technology we need today prevents you from being willing to make any kind of compromise, right? So that's one of the ideas, is like, if we only had the political will, and that then implies that there's a villain. So I've been thinking more in terms of those traditional dynamics. I think your thinking is actually very additive and interesting, which is that if the Democratic Party and climate hawks and environmentalists, well-meaning people, if they sit on their hands and then pull out the old playbook, they're just going to be so wildly irrelevant that they're not going to achieve any of their aims. So let me, but before we go there, because I do still think there's a dominant battle going on, even among the pragmatic climate left, around things like, can we like oil and gas? Like, everyone I talk to still wants to hold their nose when they talk about oil and gas, instead of just understanding just how massively important and dominant it is today and will be for decades. And that in that case, we're better off talking about how to address carbon intensity, carbon emissions, things like that. Why is perfect the enemy of good? Why do people love to hate oil and gas so much, Alex?
Well, they're utopians, right? This is the other reason that we felt like we needed to not just offer a different kind of policy agenda to what environmentalism was offering, solar, wind, net zero, keep it in the ground, whatever, but why we felt like we needed to create a whole new ism, eco-modernism, that was not utopian, that did not have at its sort of central premise the insistence that we know what the future must look like, and all that is required is the political will to get us there. The idea with eco-modernism is that we're epistemically, but also phenomenologically open to the future. That we think that there are better and worse outcomes possible, but we don't know what the world's going to look like in 2050 and 2100. And we need to plan for that sort of range of possibilities. That's not to be nihilist about it. We think that cheaper energy is good. We think that more efficient agriculture is good. We think that economic growth is good. We think that sort of resilient infrastructure is good. We think that public health is good, and we want to sort of expand those foundations and those frontiers. But we don't know what the technological or social outcomes are going to be, and so we can't say that sort of this industry is good because we think it has to run the world in 100 years, and we think this industry is bad because we think it will be obsolete in 100 years. Energy transitions are long. Energy transitions are protracted. They are dynamic. Like when Gore sort of kicked off the sort of era of the climate hawk 20 years ago, everyone, including Al Gore, assumed that natural gas would be a marginal fuel in the U.S. energy system, as it sort of had been up to that point. This was, really before the shale revolution. This was really, in the midst of a sort of under-recognized, but now, sort of fully capitalized deployment of natural gas combined cycle turbines on the power grid. And so, whatever Gore meant when he said that we have all the technologies we need, he did not foresee the shale gas revolution coming, nor did he foresee the age of AI coming. And so, I think eco-modernism is much sort of better set up to navigate those inherently unpredictable, sequence of events unfolding in real time. And that, prevents us from being sort of dogmatists about any given sort of technology or industry today. And I think it leads us to a bit more patience. Like I expect oil and gas to be with us, as you say, for many decades to come. I know plenty of eco-modernists who would rather sort of crush the oil and gas industry at a faster pace than I think is technologically or politically possible. But what we all agree on is that it will be a process, and that sort of replacing oil and gas, even just in the transportation sector, but really across the whole economy, will take decades. If that is going to happen, it's going to take many decades, and it's going to require new technologies. It's going to require new capital. It's going to require new infrastructure, and that takes a while. It takes a very long time, and not just time, but resources and politics, and simply trying to kind of vilify or outlaw existing technologies, industries, practices today, increasingly through kind of extra legislative means, I would add, is I think a very broken politics.
Yeah, I agree. And I enjoy your thinking on that. So you wrote a really great piece, Who Watches the Watchdogs, that talks about this sort of climate orthodoxy self-enforcement mechanism, which is so interesting. Like even like there's sort of the battle for the center left to like progressive left versus pragmatic left. And then there's even like a battle for purity among the most climate centric stakeholders. I'm curious. I tend to give climate activists and environmental activists across the spectrum the benefit of the doubt. I would say many of my listeners don't feel that way. They feel like there's a bit of a tribal warfare going on that isn't always sincere. What's your take? Do you think the climate enforcers are sincere?
I think the climate enforcers are sincere degrowthers.
Yeah.
I think they are sincere. Yeah. I think they are sincere in their belief that, again, we have all the technologies we need, and that we live in a world of ecological limits, and that we need to enforce sort of strict policies to keep us within those limits. And I think that they sort of latch on to any conceivable mechanism to enforce those limits that they can find. And those include things like, sort of legislative policy. This is a group of people that was overwhelmingly on board with the Green New Deal, so many years ago. But now that it's pretty obvious that both the Green New Deal and its little cousin, the Inflation Reduction Act, are not going to deliver the sort of climate and degrowth agenda that the climate movement, I think, pursues, then you see what I called the climate watch dogmatists trying to enforce sort of limits on climate, limits on emissions, limits on fossil fuels in a bunch of other ways. And those include, the sort of extra legislative policy levers that they're trying to pull through lawsuits and through sort of regulatory attempts when Democrats are in power, at least, and they're trying to enforce these rules through protests. Obviously, you mentioned the Keep It in the Ground movement, where the idea here is not that we're going to like pass a carbon tax, or we're going to not just that we're going to pass a carbon tax, or that we're going to put like regulatory limits on oil and gas production. It's that the climate movement is going to throw their bodies on the gears of oil and gas development and sort of and do what politicians can't. But then the other thing is sort of trying to enforce sort of climate orthodoxy through just cultural cultural exchange. When you see, the kind of episode that precipitated my piece on the Climate Watch dogmatists was when Matt Iglesias of slowboring.com wrote a piece arguing that the American Democratic Party needs to make some kind of peace with oil and gas interests, like a bunch of progressives in Canada and Mexico and Scandinavia have done, because they have just completely ruined both of their like political and economic agenda by pretending that we're going to phase out oil and gas in the next year, 5, 10 years or whatever. And that, a bunch of folks kind of amplified Iglesias's message on social media, like my former boss, Jesse Jenkins, a guy normally in good standing with all quadrants of the climate movement. And the Climate Watch dogmatists at the Revolving Door Project and at the American Prospect really tried to bring Jesse down a peg, accusing him of corruption and being a fossil fuel shill. And so that's what I mean when I say that the Watch dogmatists at places like the Sunrise Movement or Oil and Gas Watch or Revolving Door Project or all these places are not just trying to like sue the government to enforce emissions targets that have not been actually passed through legislation, but they're also trying to police discourse and to police ideas through these alleged kind of watchdog organizations like the Revolving Door Project. And I think again that it might be sincere, but it's totally anti-small d democratic. It's anti-small l liberal. It is opposed to the free exchange of ideas, and besides which it is totally doomed as a way to deal with climate change or to deal with energy abundance. But I do agree with you, Tisha, that it might not be doomed as a political project in its own right, because it's still going. I don't think they're going to pass a lot of laws, and I don't. Yeah,
it really is. Like, it has way more legs than I ever would think that it had at this particular political moment.
Yeah, well, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush here, because there are sort of quadrants of the more sort of official, institutionalized environmental movement that I admire in a bunch of ways, on their policy work, on their sort of vision for decarbonization and clean energy policy and all that. But I think that the salient thing to remember there is that the American environmental movement is a $10 billion a year industry, and even if they all could get together and decide to really reckon with the end of their era, as I think they should, it would be hard. I think the generous way to describe it is that they kind of have an MO, they kind of have a standard operating procedure. The world has totally changed under their feet, and they don't know what to do about it. So they're lashing out. And I think that that's bad, and I think that that's stupid, and I think that that's destructive, and I think it's anti-democratic and all of these things. For my part, I want to call that out, and I want to encourage some soul searching, and I want to encourage some reforms, and I want to encourage, sort of philanthropy to stop supporting some of these crazier things. But it's again, the patient, generous way to describe the kind of keep it in the ground Climate Watch dogmatist is that it's a very, very big battleship that has a lot of inertia built up over the last 20 years. A lot of foot soldiers in that battleship. I'm mixing, branches of the military in my metaphorizing here. But there's a lot of inertia and momentum in the climate movement, and they have not shown themselves sort of ready to adapt to the new circumstances, I would say.
Yeah, I think that was a patient and generous way of describing it, and accurate. Let's talk about. Let's just say the battleship of the environmental movement turn successfully. and so essentially it becomes like a key component of the progressive left, the farthest left. And then there's really this more general battle for the center left Democrat take on things, including energy and climate. How would you describe, are there factions within the center left around energy and climate, and how would you describe that?
Well, one dynamic is attitudes and also just sort of policy positioning around oil and gas, right? That's a big one. I mean, you also have some disagreements about nuclear, and within that about big nuclear versus small nuclear. And then you have some disagreements about, cars versus transit. There's a whole bunch of sort of like very fractalizing niche divisions within the kind of center left about both like energy and climate politics, but also politics generally. But a really big one, which is why I think Iglesias pointed it out, is this division over how to think about oil and gas as a deliverer of energy and of energy abundance and sort of economic affordability in low oil and gas prices, and an important industry for employment and also for ripple effects through the economy from all the investment in oil and gas. And I think that's a big division. Another division is around this sort of conventional environmental policy that has been passed. So I think that, you have an increasing uptake of the so-called abundance agenda within like at least the National Democratic Party right now. You have folks talking about, like almost all Democrats except for Bernie Sanders voted for the Advance Act, which is a big pro-nuclear piece of legislation passed in 2024. That couldn't have happened 10, 20 years ago. And so you have a lot of Democrats and folks on the center left talking about the need for more transmission and the need to actually expand energy capacity to meet the growing demand of AI and electric vehicles and things like that. So you have, I think, an important kind of faction who's talking about building, who's talking about energy abundance, but you still can't really get a critical mass of Democrats to sign up for permitting reform, for instance, at the federal level. This is something that I'm dealing with on a day-to-day basis right now. Democrats, even the ones who say they listen to Ezra Klein and they want a clean energy abundant future, and of course we probably need to take another look at NEPA and at historic preservation and all of these 50-year-old, 60-year-old environmental statutes. They don't actually do it. And I think that, so there's both there's a kind of ambition gap there, but I also think there's a political one in which it's become a little too easy for Democrats to say they're in favor of environmental regulatory reform without actually doing anything about it. And I think permitting reform.
I think permitting reform actually is the playground where you can see the power of climate orthodoxy. You can see its power, because people will in the abstract say, we should be able to build things. We should be able to build things, but not those things, not everything, not if we have to acknowledge trade-offs. Like there's a real, I think it's interesting that you call it an ambition gap. And I don't know if it's ambition or like intellectual continuity or just the power like of the battleship, the energy climate battleship. It hasn't been replaced by something compelling enough yet that Democrats feel like they can be for. And so I think you're absolutely right that the center left is busy like making intellectual cases for big nuclear versus small nuclear. And actually what we need to be articulating is a vision to replace the old orthodoxy. Like we need a new, and I think abundance has some of those characteristics, but it hasn't taken on hold exactly yet. Do you think that's fair?
No, that's extremely fair. And what the finer point that I would put on it for my many friends in the abundance movement is that that battleship of the sort of old school institutional environmentalist movement is mostly our opponents. Even though they talk about climate change, even though they talk about renewables, even though they increasingly talk about sort of energy abundance, transmission, solar, batteries, even though a lot of times they talk about sort of permitting reform in vague, subtle, ways. The NRDC and the Sierra Club and the League of Conservation Voters and Greenpeace USA, and a couple $1 billion worth of other national and local climate and environment groups are still showing up every day to oppose permitting reform, to oppose nuclear, to oppose carbon capture, obviously to oppose any oil and gas operation in the United States. And that's a big political battle that I think the kind of abundance movement and the sort of center left of the Democratic Party still is not on a firm footing to face. Because maybe they think of themselves as environmentalists because they care about the environment, which is a different thing than being an environmentalist. Maybe they haven't really kind of gotten their head around the need to develop a new framework or a new paradigm. Maybe they're afraid of what the green groups will do or say about them politically. But whatever the sort of confluence of excuses that we have are for not kind of like going to battle with the kind of anti-permitting, anti-nuclear, anti-energy abundance environmental movement, it's a huge problem.
Well, I think it's really helpful to hear you say that, because I do actually think the only effective critiques are in-group critiques. Like, it is absolutely useless for the oil and gas industry to critique climate activists. You're not going to get any traction there, but there is more effective engagement among some in groups. So I do appreciate that. Let me jump a little bit ahead to one key thing I want to get out of our conversation, which is I wanted to have you on because my audience, which is largely oil and gas leaders who are thinking pragmatically about the future, but also thinking about the next political pendulum swing, where maybe we're not in a world that feels like everything has changed forever and is pro oil and gas at a federal level. And so I have been making the case that we need to really cultivate and curate a healthy political center, a center left and a center right. So we don't just populist swing right to left, because I think it's pretty obvious to me that a populist left swing will just re-engage the old climate orthodoxy and kind of a degrowth mentality. So creating some kind of vibrant center is important. It's still, as the Iglesias piece proved, it is still deeply risky for environmental think tanks, organizations to team up with oil and gas companies, to team up with oil and gas executives. But it's going to have to happen for us to make progress. So what would you want to see from oil and gas companies, from oil and gas executives, from leaders in the space for you to think that's a partner? I'm willing to take a risk with them to, I don't know, co-author a piece, go on stage together, have a conversation, collaborate on something. What do you wish you would see from this industry to think these are partners worth taking a risk for?
One of our observations at Breakthrough, since our founding, was that we were not going to regulate greenhouse emissions the way we regulated criteria pollutants like lead and mercury and SOx and NOx and particulates and things like that. So, carbon, methane are just like much more embedded in the sort of core, industrial productivity than things like mercury and lead and things are. So that's not how we're going to deal with the climate problem and the global greenhouse problem. I think how we deal with emissions is an unsolved problem, actually, to be clear. I think we have a vision, which has always been to make clean energy cheap, whether that means nuclear or solar or natural gas plants with carbon removal or whatever. But making clean energy cheap, as I was getting at before, is a long process. And moving to increasingly energy abundant, low carbon technologies is a long, protracted, dynamic process. So I think, but climate change remains a mounting risk globally. And climate change is caused largely by the products that oil and gas companies sell that, again, consumers buy for good reason, right? We need to heat our homes, we need to drive our cars, we need to power our tractors, we need to make petrochemicals and fertilizers. Most of those things we can't do without oil and gas. So I think telling that story remains important, and I think telling the story of being sort of globally responsible producers remains important. I think that this is something that a lot of the I think a lot of the industry has felt salient for a while, but I think could sort of sweep over the oil and gas industry even more. And the industry better than I do. But I think that the sort of posture over the last 10, 20 years of sort of the climate movement versus the oil and gas industry has created a kind of a politics that is overly adversarial about climate change, when in fact, U.S. oil and gas producers can and should be, the most productive, sustainable oil and gas producers in the world. And by that, I don't mean that the combustion of their products won't emit carbon emissions, especially in the near term. But I do mean that it is increasingly important globally, for instance, that natural gas is produced with low upstream methane emissions, relatively low venting and flaring. And that creates that lowers emissions, right? And it creates a comparative advantage for U.S. oil and gas producers compared to our competitors in the Middle East, in Latin America, in Russia, in China. And so I think that there is a kind of renewed possibility for the oil and gas industry to understand itself as sort of contributors to emissions reductions and to sort of sustainable energy production in a way that the climate movement has historically made it, in a way that not only the climate movement has historically made it difficult, but in a way that I think has caused a bunch of sort of folks in the oil and gas industry to be hesitant to do. So I think that is one thing. Another thing is just to is to kind of figure out ways to expand energy abundance, even outside of sort of pump jacks, in the American landscape. This is not a novel observation or insight or anything, but I think it is true that the oil and gas industry has a lot of sort of industrial and technical knowledge to share with the carbon removal industry, with the clean fuels industry, with the next generation fertilizers and petrochemicals, geothermal, and there are a whole bunch of ways that I think the fossil fuel industry does and can continue to accelerate energy innovation and expand energy abundance. And then the other thing would just be that I do think that the sort of natural gas industry in particular is going to be elemental to getting the massive but still I think nascent artificial intelligence industry off the ground. And I think sort of more so than in recent history, oil and especially natural gas are powering the frontier of American industry and innovation in a way that, again, to get to the point I was making at the top of our conversation, Tisha, just changes the whole frame and landscape for our politics, not just our energy policy and politics.
So I'm going to summarize what you said, because I think it's really important for our audience in terms of the call. I think the call to action I'd love the audience to take away from this conversation, which is, one, as an oil and gas producer, just be best in class. Be best in class in all the things, but particularly carbon intensity. Two, Do your part, take the show on the road to expand energy abundance, innovation, playing in the decarb spaces, bringing our know-how to the broadening of energy infrastructure and abundance. So I think that's a really good one. And then the third one that you said essentially is do your part to build the energy system of the future to support the AI revolution that is underway. I do think, like you, that there's going to be a shit ton of natural gas built to support data center expansion, and our listeners should make sure that this also is best in class. Let's just not do a super fast nonsensical build out. Let's thoughtfully create the energy system of the future in partnership with our communities. I think that's going to be really important. So that's what I heard from you, Alex. So thank you. And that would make us good partners. And then we don't have to be the old school pariahs of the environmental climate movement. I took a U-turn earlier to go back and sort of go into the climate orthodoxy. Let's take one more U-turn for my final question. Give you a chance to end on a techno optimistic note, the space you and I both want to live. This is the final question I asked all my guests. Alex, what are you most optimistic about?
I'm sort of repeating myself, but I said, I think 6 or 12 months ago that I was an AI lukewarmer, that, AI seems important. I'm not a doomer. I don't think the apocalypse is right around the corner, but I'm not sure I'm an optimist either. I think I'm closer to an optimist today. And I say that as, someone who runs a think tank full of researchers who are using these tools just over the last few weeks to kind of radically expand our sort of research and analytical capabilities. And by that, I overwhelmingly mean that, we have sort of analysts and research directors here at Breakthrough who, were here 1, 2, 5, 10 years ago, and they're still here, but now what they're capable of doing, and sort of creating good, what we call breakthroughvian, sort of paradigm shifting analysis and writing in the world has become easier, faster, sort of bigger. And that's just from my corner of the economy as someone who runs a kind of medium-sized policy think tank. In my personal life, in my household, actually, my wife is the one who is making the most use of these chatbots to kind of, find good answers when, our son has a rash. And it's like, should we take him to the doctor? Take a look at this picture, or improve the organization of our household finances or whatever. So I just over the last few months, I've become, I think, an AI optimist. That there's all sorts of reasons to be anxious about labor and productivity dislocations, and obviously or not obviously, chatbots, creating microbes that wipe out humanity, and robot armies that sort of take over the planet. I don't want to say that those are impossibilities, but I do just see everywhere I look now sort of new things that humans can do, and that humans can do in community with each other. Again, I think there will be a lot of ways in which the chatbots can kind of further atomize us and keep us glued to our screens. And I don't want to be blasé about those things, but it does feel like the kind of biggest technological leap forward of my lifetime just starting right now. I think it kind of redounds back to the energy and climate conversation that we're having, Tisha, for all the reasons that we've talked about, that this is a new industry creating new demand for energy abundance, including clean energy abundance and other sort of frontier industries of the future. But I also just think it kind of could shake up what has been a fairly kind of stagnant society and culture in terrifying, but I hope kind of productive, dynamic ways. I'm not the only, I'm not the only, I might be late to the party on AI optimism compared to a bunch of other folks I know, but that reflects kind of where I am today.
Well, I think that skepticism is warranted, But the dynamism that you refer to also creates, it just breaks the logjam of energy and climate politics and requires of us that we think more nimbly, more optimistically, more forward toward the future. And I think that in itself is also optimistic. So Alex, thank you so much for joining me on the Energy Things podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Tisha. This was a pleasure.
Awesome. Okay. Welcome to Energy Things, a podcast about leading into the energy future. I'm Tisha Schuler, your host and the CEO of Adamantine Energy. As many of you know, my book, The Myth and the Moment, From Polarization to Progress in the New Energy Landscape, is out. And now I'm really thinking about what comes next in the political world and the policy space. So I'm having conversations with people in and around the center left to think about this stuff. But before I tell you about today's guest, I will just let you know that I am a quick personal update. I'm back from a trip to Paris that was amazing and awesome, where we announced a collaboration with the Department of Energy and the Rockefeller Institute on behalf of Energy Corps for a clean cooking accelerator initiative. So I'll talk about more about that in a future solo pod. And then I went almost straight to Costa Rica, where I did my surfing adventure, and it was epic. It did not disappoint. And the weird Pilates that I did was actually super helpful. So more to come in a future solar pod, but I want you to know that both of those trips happened with success. And now I am 5 weeks of back-to-back travel. So it's going to be a little hectic, but super interesting and super fun. I'll keep you posted. So on today's show, I get to speak with a longtime friend and colleague, Alex Trembath. He is executive director at the Breakthrough Institute. Incidentally, I am the chair of the board of the Breakthrough Institute. And so I have been on that board for close to maybe 8 years, close to the beginning of when it rolled out as its own nonprofit. And I'm very, very proud of my association. And I want to talk to Alex because, as you'll hear, he is an original thinker on energy, climate, politics, the future, technology, innovation. And I like to stress test my thinking, but also I wanted you to hear about, in particular, what does the world look like for these partners to the industry, the people that we actually want to be wildly successful on the left. What does the world look like to them? What do they think? What do they think about us? So I think you're really going to enjoy our conversation. If you would like to know more about our work at Adamantine, please go to energythinks.com. While you are there, I hope you will subscribe to my weekly newsletter. Both of these things are true. Please enjoy my conversation with Alex Trembath. That's our episode for today. Thanks so much to you, our listeners, for being here, giving me an excuse to have these awesome conversations. I loved that conversation with Alex. I really enjoyed the getting to recap his feedback. You know, what do you need from the oil and gas industry to be a good partner, to take a risk with them? I really enjoyed that recap. I hope that you will take a moment and rate and review Energy Thinks. It helps people find us. It would also be amazing if you would go to Amazon and give my book, The Myth and the Moment, a 5-star review. It will help people find it. Please go to energythinks.com and subscribe to my weekly newsletter. Both of these things are true. I'd like to thank my colleague, Elena Heyer, for making this podcast possible. Until next time, I'm Tisha Schuler, wishing you and yours happiness, prosperity, and good health.
You froze for a few seconds there for me, so do you mind re-recording that really quickly?
No, which one, the top or
Just the outro?
Just the outro, sure,
Yeah.
No problem.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah. That's our episode for today. Thanks so much to you, our listeners, for your continued engagement. And I want to thank Alex also for joining me. For those of you who are maybe new to thinking about the Breakthrough Institute, If you want to support this organization and you have a little family philanthropy or something, please reach out to me. I would love to get more diverse support for that organization. And I think the work they're doing is just incredible. The thing that stayed with me from my conversation with Alex was really this idea of what would make us a good partner, what makes us worth the risk of engaging with. I really enjoyed that part of the conversation. I hope you will take a moment and rate and review this podcast so that others in the industry can find us. Also, could you go to Amazon and give my book, The Myth and the Moment, a 5-star review? That'd be awesome. That would really help. Go to energythinks.com if you would like to know more about our work at Adamantine. And while you're there, please subscribe to my newsletter. Both of these things are true. I'd like to thank my colleague, Elena Heyer, for making Energy Thinks possible. Until next time, I'm Tisha Schuler, wishing you and yours happiness, prosperity, and good health.